Bienvenidos, Ushamdeed, and welcome to this NetAcad Introduction to Python course supplemental video tutorial on Lab 5.1.6.4. Now, this lab is going to introduce us to the idea of exceptions and how we raise exceptions. And most importantly, we're going to compare and contrast what happens when we use the try except statement as opposed to simply letting the program naturally handle the error. Now, remember, if there's an error in the program, what Python is going to do is it's simply going to exit out, and that may or may not be what we want to have happen. And so this lab is all about creating a function, and again, the definition for the function has already been provided to us, but what we're going to do is fill in the body of that function to make sure that we are reading integers safely. So let's dive in and take a look at the requirements for Lab 5.1.6.4. Now, before we do that, this is a fantastic resource, right? You can take a look for the or you can simply just Google Python exceptions, built-in exceptions, and you can choose from the different releases that are out there. You've got the Pre 3.9, the Dev 3.10, and again, it's going to show you the exceptions that you can try to catch, so to speak, and prevent your program from bombing out. Right? So let's take a look right now at 5.1.6.4. Now, estimated time 15 to 25 minutes, level of difficulty medium, and we're going to improve our skills on defining functions, and we're going to use some exceptions. Now, the task is to write a function able to input integer values and to check to see if they're within a specified range. Now, here are the requirements. We're going to accept 3 arguments, right? And you can see here that we've got this v is going to be the variable that's going to contain the value that gets returned from the function above, right? And you can see here, read int, that's the function. So here is the prompt that is being sent into that function. And let me go ahead and we'll get the drawing tool up here and see if we can't make this a little more clear. So here is the prompt, and you can see that is the first argument that's going to be the first positional parameter in the function. Then we'll circle the next argument that would be the second positional parameter, and then finally put a square around this. That is going to be the third positional parameter that goes into this function. So we've got our arguments here that are calling, right? And this is our caller. And whatever the result is going to be returned and stored in the variable v. Now, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to print out what is in that variable, right? What value is in that variable v. And this is where the key details of what we're supposed to do inside that function come into play. And so right here, our first, our first instruction is if the user enters a string that is not an integer value, the function should emit the following message. And so we're going to have a try except block. Now, the question is, what will that except block look like? Specifically, what exception are we going to try to capture? And this is where we're going to segue just briefly here to talk about the fact that there are, last time I checked, 63 built-in exceptions in Python, right? And we saw what some of those might look like. Let me clear this here, and we'll transition back over to the built-in exceptions. And so here you can see what a lot of those exceptions are. Now, the base classes, right? You can see we've got this exception, base exception, and that's sort of the most general exception. That is literally going to catch all the other exceptions, right? So if you think about it in terms of like a hierarchy that you might see, and let me see here. Whoops, sorry, I don't want to click on that. We want to come back here. So you can see the exception hierarchy. This is where I wanted to click. And you can see at the very top, and we'll call it sort of like I want you to think of it as like a pyramid, right? At the top of the pyramid is the base exception. So if in the interactive interpreter, I was to come over here and say, try, and let's try something. We'll say, x is going to be given the result of 1 divided by 0. Now, we know that we can't do that, right? Because we can't divide by 0. And so if I say except, and we were to say base exception, right? If I'm doing that, I want you to remember that that is the most generalized way that we can catch an exception, because this is going to literally catch all exceptions. Any exception that might be raised, like 0 division error, is going to be caught here. Now, that syntax right there, except base exception, is the same as that syntax right there. This, except colon, implies that what, oops, sorry, I didn't want to get rid of everything, implies that what I'm really saying is except base exception, right? But again, you don't have to put the base exception. You can just simply put the colon, and that would mean the same thing. But that is really, really general, right? And so while that would work in our code for the function we're going to be creating, we want to be a little bit smarter about that, because, again, we want to be as specific as we possibly can, right? Sometimes it's okay to be general. Maybe, if you're doing some kind of troubleshooting, you can start from being very general and work your way to being more specific, and let me jump out of here. And so what we want to do here is what would happen, right? Remember, the first requirement that we've got here is if the user enters a string that is not an integer. Well, how could I test that in the interactive interpreter? Let's step to the interactive interpreter here, and I'm going to say x is going to be assigned the value, the variable x will be assigned the value of integer, and what if it didn't get an integer? What if I put in here a string like hello? Because this is going to show me what the error would be, or what the exception, the syntax error, the exception would be. Right? And we can see it is a value error, invalid literal for, excuse me, for integer with base 10. Hello, right? So we entered a string instead of an integer. Let's go back over here, come over to our exceptions, and you can see we've got the base exception. Well, where in the hierarchy is the value exception? And we're looking for value error. And you can see here we've got the value error right here. And this is raised when an operation or function receives an argument that has the right type but an inappropriate value. And the situation is not described by a more precise exception, such as index error. So remember, what we got here was value error. We put something in there, right? But it's not an integer. And so if we go back, let's come back up to the top here, look at the hierarchy, you can see that when we come down just a little bit further, here is the value error. It's right here, right? So again, if I was to say, base exception, well, it's going to catch that value error exception because the value error exception in the hierarchy is below the base exception. But we want to be a little more precise, right? We want to use this value error. And so that's what we would end up using in our function. So again, let me step back over here, and you can see if the user enters a string that's not an integer value, the function should emit an error message. So that's going to be the error that we emit. And ask the user to input the value again. And so that is going to be our prompt, right? We're going to continually prompt the user until we get a value in the range -10 to 10. Now, if the user enters a number that falls outside the specified range, the function should emit the message error, the value is not within the permitted range. Now, this is sort of, when we're reading these instructions here, this is giving us sort of the order of operations. Number one, we're going to check to see, did the user enter an integer value? That's what we're asking for. If they entered an integer value, then does it fall within the range, right? So our try except block is checking to make sure an integer has been entered. An if statement is going to take care of whether or not, if that input is valid, is it within the range? And if it's not within the range, we continue to run our program, prompting the user to enter in a value, right? And so this sort of, think of it as an infinite loop, right? Which we can typically do with a while statement. So let's come out here and let's start to get a little coding dropped into our program here. And we'll get rid of the writing tool for the time being. So this is where our code would go. Excuse me. And let me go ahead and clean that up. And so here we go. So we're in the function definition for read int. I'm going to space in 4 spaces. I had a user viewer this week ask, why 4 spaces? Remember, PEP 8, right? PEP-8, the Python enhancement proposal. And it's best practice to use 4 spaces for readability. So we're going to say while true, meaning that while we are in this function and the Boolean true is not being, I should say, we don't have anything happening with inside this function that is going to exit us from this function, that we are going to continually do the following. We are going to try, right? So I'm going to try something, and I'm going to catch something if an exception gets raised. And so here, this was a sort of little tricky syntax here for a number of learners. We're going to say value, and what are we going to ascribe, right, or assign to that variable value, where it's going to be, remember, we want an integer, and that integer is, oops, sorry, let's get this back up here. We want to do input, and the input is going to be what comes in from the prompt, right? Now, this may look a little sneaky here, but there is the prompt, right? And remember, here's our first positional parameters, the prompt. And remember, the prompt is this enter the number from negative 10 to 10. And so this is actually going to be printed to the screen, right? We're prompting for input. And remember, when input captures what the user has typed in from standard in, which is our keyboard, it takes it as a string, which is why we are going to typecast, right, or convert it to an integer, okay? But remember, we can't just convert any string to an integer. It's got to be something that we would be able to convert in the sense that it would be a number, right? So 1, 2, 55, something like that. It can't be hello, right? Because that is not going to work. We saw that right over here, right? When we tried to do typecasting of this string hello. And in fact, if I was to come over here and say x and int and then say hello, right? We're going to end up with a name error because hello is not defined. And again, I saw that I had the string defined. I wanted to show you what it would look like without a string being defined if it was just hello. But remember, input is going to give us a string from what the user enters when they are prompted. And so, again, this was sort of a little tricky right here to use those sort of 3 different components of this program. Now, so we try that. We know that if the user doesn't enter a legitimate integer value, right, something that we could typecast to an integer value, then what's going to end up happening is we want to catch that with our exception. Now, I could do this, but again, that's very basic or very general because it's basically saying that. Except base exception, which is every single exception that's out there, right? So, and again, remember, that exceptions are objects. Just like everything else we do, exceptions are objects. And so we're going to say except, and we know that if a string comes in and I can't convert that string to an integer, we're going to get a value error, right? And so what are we supposed to say, right? What is the program supposed to say? And let me get the print statement fired up here. And so the print statement says, if the user enters a string that is not an integer value, the function should emit the message, error, wrong input. And so we'll kind of spice this up a little bit. So I'll say error, excuse me, wrong input. And then let's say, try that again with an integer. All right. And so if the user does not enter an integer, we go into the try block here. An exception would be raised that we're going to catch, a value exception. We're going to print this message out, and then where do we go next? We go right back up into the while loop, and we try again to prompt the user to get an integer back in response. Now, let's take it to the next step. The user does enter a value that we can convert or typecast to an integer. Now, what are we checking next? Well, we're checking to see if the user enters a number which falls outside the specified range, the function should give this message right here. Error, the value is not within the permitted range, min-max, and then ask the user to input the value again, or input a new value again. And so do we need a try block, or do we need to stay within that try block or try to figure out how to do that? And the answer is no, we don't, right? We do need to be indented 4 spaces inside the while loop here. You can see we come straight down from our while loop. And so here's where I can now deal with checking the value, right? To see, does it fall within the range that we're working with? So again, I want you to think of it like this. The try except block gets us through the task of identifying, do we have a legitimate value that we can use as an integer value? Now, once that try except block is complete, right? Meaning we go ahead and successfully get the value, the variable value, assigned an integer value, then what are we going to do? Well, we want to go ahead and check to see, is that integer value in the range that we're working with? And so here's where we can use that if statement. So I'm going to say, if the value is less than the minimum, right? Not less than or equal to. If it is strictly less than the minimum or, right? So if either of these two things are true, or the value is greater than the max, strictly greater than the maximum value, meaning if it's less than -10 or it's greater than 10, right? Not inclusive here. If it is less than -10, strictly less than, or strictly greater than 10, then what are we going to do? Well, let's take a look at that error value, or I'm sorry, the error message that they want us to print out here. And let me see if I can just grab this here and bring it over here, and let's see what that is going to look like. So if it's outside the value, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print that out. Now, there are we could do some tricky things here and maybe print out the minimum maximum value. And it does say in the prompt, it gives the values in the prompt, right? So we could go ahead and then cast these integers, typecast the integers to strings inside of a print, and we're doing concatenation, but we'll keep it simple here, right? Because that is going to achieve the purpose that we want. So if it's not in the right range, we're going to print that error message out, and we would then go back up to the next iteration of this while loop. Because remember, the while loop is going to run forever. It's an infinite loop, right? Until something happens to get us out of that loop. And that is going to be our else statement. Because if the value is not less than the minimum and it's not greater than the maximum, meaning it is in the range we're looking for, then we're simply going to return the value. And that should be it. And again, you could look at it like this. Let me drop down one more here. Oops, sorry. I'm going to put in some hash signs here, pound signs, right? So there's the function. And again, this is not something that you would do. I'm doing this for demonstrative purposes, to basically draw a line here to say, here is our caller, right? And here is our function. And this function does everything that we have been asked to do. It checks to ensure that the value is, in fact, an integer value. If it's not, we get an exception raised that we handle. If we didn't handle this exception, and sometimes I use the word catch, right? If we don't catch the exception, Python's going to do what Python does. It's going to blow up and exit the program because it has recognized that there's something's not right, something's wrong. And so we go ahead and we exit the program, but we've caught that exception. And so it's going to go and go and go until a value gets entered in that's legitimate. Now, once we get an integer value, then we come down and we check to see if it's in the range that's acceptable, -10 to 10. If it's not, we print this error message out. If it is, we've got the value that we're looking for that is in the range that we're looking for. So let's return that value to the caller. And that is going to get captured in the variable v. And then we simply print out the number is, and whatever that number was. So now, final test, excuse me. Let's go ahead and let's run this program. And they had, I want to make sure we follow along here. So they enter 100, then ASD, and then they actually start entering some right input. So we'll say 100. And we would expect to see that, hey, that's not within the permitted range. Then we have ASD. ASD. And again, the exception has been caught, right? It was raised, we caught it. We handled it. The program continues to run. And so then if I did 99 or if I did, some crazy number, you can see that it's catching these numbers that are not in that range we're looking for. And so now let's enter 9, which is in the range, and it prints up 9. Right now, let's do another test here. Let's go ahead and say F5. We'll rerun it. What about -10? Yeah, that's within our range. And you can see we haven't tested 10 yet, so let's test 10. Let's make sure that the boundaries of the range are matching properly, are being accounted for properly here as being in that range from -10 to 10. All right, well, there you have it. That is my final solution to Lab 5.1.6.4. We talked about exceptions, right? I would highly recommend taking a look at the exception hierarchy. And again, last check, I think there's like 63 different exceptions that you can look at. There's a hierarchy there. We looked at the different syntax. Except : is really saying except base exception : which means I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to catch everything. But that might not always be what you want to do. All right. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you've picked up something here. You've learned something. And I hope to see you in the next video.